Let's look now at some of the cultural developments that occurred during Republican Rome. The Romans were much more concerned with conquering and ruling than with art and letters. They believed they were divinely appointed to conquer and rule the world, and so they didn't necessarily have the focus and the concern that the Greeks did about producing great art and great literature. So it's not surprising that when Rome did conquer Greece in the 3rd century, that they began to follow the Greek models for literature, art, and architecture. So they took examples from these Greek models and they adapted them for their own purposes. So in other words, they didn't reinvent the wheel. They took what was there and they made it their own, so to speak. Now, I want to mention a very famous Roman poet that was writing during this Republican period. And his name is Catullus. And Catullus was a very famous lyric poet who imitated the works of the Greek poet Sappho. And Sappho wrote lyric poetry, and so Catullus follows in her footsteps a little bit and imitates what she does. Now, Catullus wrote long poems on Greek myth. He wrote marriage hymns. He wrote personal attacks on politicians. So he did some kind of literary heavy lifting, if you want to look at it that way. But interestingly, he's most famous for his lyrics, those poems that do imitate the Greek models. And particularly his lyrics about his tumultuous relationship with his love, who he calls in the poems Lesbia. And in these poems, he just goes on and on and on about his feelings toward her. And you guys have as an assignment coming up to read several of these poems, and I hope you will be able to see how his emotions change as their relationship changes. So Catullus was quite an important literary figure during this time. Perhaps, though, the most important text that began during the Republic was the Jus Civile, or basically their law code. And the goal here was to unify all the laws, all the rules and regulations that had been passed by the Republican government into one body of work. And so, not surprisingly, the Jus Civile covered all areas of life. It was used as a model for later periods, and it did influence Western legal systems, particularly the points in the Civile that highlight equality. Remember, Rome is a republic at this point, and the goal of all republics is universal equality or equity. And so you can see that theme run throughout this text. And it's those ideas of equality that later Western democracies and Western republics tap into as they're writing their own documents, like the Constitution, for example. The Jus Civile was worked on and worked on and worked on, and it ultimately received its final form in 533 AD under then Roman Emperor Justinian. Now, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, the art and architecture of the Republic were also translations, adaptations, and amplifications of Greek forms. So they took the Greek forms and they made them their own. And one of the ways we really see that happening is in the art. And the Romans wanted to focus on individuality. They believed that appearance revealed character. So their artists try to infuse their works with individual characteristics. Now, this came in handy for the politicians of the day because they could use this art as propaganda to reflect a particular image to the public. Republican Rome did not have television, it didn't have newspapers, and it certainly didn't have the internet. And so a picture, as they say, would tell 1,000 stories. And so what you had were politicians having art made of themselves that they hoped would reflect a particular character or particular ideas and values. Now these are two busts. One is of Cicero and one is of Caesar, both men heavily involved in the Republican government in Rome. And you can see here this Roman idea that art should in fact reflect personality and character, and how it can be used to sort of convey a sense of a person to another person. Now, most Romans weren't big into philosophy. They remained very superstitious. They clung to their beliefs in traditional gods and goddesses. But some did choose to embrace certain Greek philosophies. And the main ones that they gravitated toward were these two: Epicureanism and Stoicism. The goal of the Epicureans is pleasure, and they reject any divine force, and their goal in life is to seek freedom for punishment or pain of death. So they sort of have this attitude of eat, drink, and be merry, seize the day, let's maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain. The Stoics, on the other hand, were much more controlled. They were much more balanced. They believed that everything was governed by reason, and that being virtuous meant desiring only that which a person could control. So this is a very more measured type of philosophy. And most Romans tended to gravitate toward Stoicism.